Polling in Canada consistently shows between 80 and 90% of Canadians want the Canada-U.S. border to remain closed due to America's lack of control over the coronavirus. How long will they get their way? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. The longest undefended border in the world has been closed to all but essential travel since March 21st. 29 U.S. Congress members have written the Canadian government to start making a plan for when the border can open safely. Almost $630 billion annually is traded between the two. But the fear is palpable in Canadians as they see the pandemic out of control, having claimed more than 190,000 lives in counting. Our two economies are intertwined, and with both facing stark economic futures, there are people who want to see business resume to offset the impact. Today on the Unpublished Cafe, we'll take a look at when the border may reopen or should reopen. Eric Miller is the president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, and he joins us now. And Eric, can you give me some concrete examples of how the border closing has impacted business on either side?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me on today. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So the way that the border closure was implemented was that, in essence, goods would be able to continue to move freely. So you will still notice grapes from California in the supermarkets in Canada, and you will notice Canadian components going to factories in the U.S. Where the closure has really impacted is in the area of what's called trade and services. So people traveling back and forth for meetings and conferences and to see clients and to develop business between the two countries. Because so-called non-essential travel has been effectively shuttered, and any travel that does go on requires a 14-day quarantine, a huge reduction in the amount of cross-border commerce has occurred, even though it hasn't shown up necessarily in terms of shortages of goods that may be coming into Canada from the U.S.
Is this issue on the radar at the White House?
Oh, yeah, it's very much on the radar at the White House. Now, what you see at the White House is an administration that is supportive fundamentally, and I think instinctively, of closing borders. And so you've heard a lot during the Trump administration about the border wall and the need to control borders. So when you have a country like Canada that comes forward and says, we want to control movement across our borders, the Trump administration was all too happy to oblige.
Now, Canadians overwhelmingly don't want the border to reopen. 80 to 90% polling in a number of surveys over the last month or so. How do you convince Canadians that it's soon time to reopen?
Well, the way you have to convince Canadians of doing that is you need a credible plan. Because the challenge that we've been dealing with is there has been no credible plan. It's been, let's reopen and imagine that this pandemic is still not going on. And so simply reopening without a structured, normalized process in place is something that you will never convince people is a good idea. And so one idea that I've been promoting is the idea of a double negative test. And you've seen this being introduced in Dubai, for example, on U.S. travelers. And what that means fundamentally is you get a certain designated type of COVID test before you leave the United States. You can be retested by the Public Health Agency of Canada when you arrive in Canada. These, by definition, have to be rapid tests. And if you get negative in both, then you can go about your business without a 14-day quarantine period. But until you have proper testing that is credible and Canadians feel is reflecting accurate results, it's going to be very difficult to convince them to allow the border to reopen.
Is it the lack of credible testing that's the issue?
A big part of the challenge is testing, because we humans are preternaturally inclined to fear the other in many senses. And I mean, my brother lives in Nova Scotia and has a cottage in New Brunswick. And until they created the Atlantic bubble, he was not able to go to his cottage. And on the first weekend that they did, he spent 7 hours getting to his cottage in what's normally a 3-hour drive to New Brunswick, because they were testing everyone who was crossing the border. But now that they've done that and they've shown that this has not increased the instances of coronavirus in New Brunswick or into Nova Scotia, you found a certain willingness to allow that to happen. And so you have to credibly let people see that by allowing more travel into the country or across borders, that you're not going to increase the infection rates, notably, of this pandemic in Canada. And that's what it's going to take.
Eric Miller joining us in the Unpublished Cafe. He's president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group as we talk about when the Canada-U.S. border may or should reopen. And, you know, we talk about border cities, and, you know, a little later in the show, we'll be talking to one of the MPs from Windsor. Here in Eastern Ontario, Kingston being the big issue, it seems some Americans have got the issue. They don't mind just driving their boats across and going for a shop in Kingston without checking in with the border. And you know, that's where some Canadians are having a big issue in these border cities.
Yeah, and you've seen these challenges that have come up really over the last 20 years. And so one of the things when I've worked a lot on border issues, that you would have CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection telling boaters along the border, look, if you're going to go in these waterways in the Thousand Islands or wherever it is, that you have to bring your passport because it's pretty easy to cross the border. And if you've had someone who's been used to doing things a certain way and they figure, well, nobody's going to really bother me anyway, then they're going to go ahead and do it. I mean, you can't stop everyone from engaging in behavior that they shouldn't engage in. But a lot of public outreach and education and indeed enforcement is going to be necessary in order to dissuade people from ignoring the rules that they may feel shouldn't apply to them.
You know, Eric, with so much public reticence by Canadians about reopening the border, how do you approach that politically? That you're going to have to convince Canadians who don't want to how this is the right thing to do. How do you do that?
Right. So the way that you approach it politically is to say, look, here are our parameters or our guidelines for what we will allow to happen. Because Canada is not in a situation where it can or even should be in a situation where it says until you do X, these states in the U.S. or this federal government in the United States, that we're not going to talk about it. Where Canada really has its authority begin is when people arrive at the border and into Canada. And if you look at the numbers, even with the 6 million infections that you have in the United States, that's less than 2% of the whole U.S. population, which means that 98% of Americans do not have the COVID-19 virus. But in order to allow those healthy people in, you need to be able to readily test and identify them. And that means laying out a pathway to say, here's how we're going to know. And this is why I've been pushing for the double negative test, which is if you test somebody once, you can get an anomaly. If you test somebody twice, it's very likely a pattern. And I don't think Canadians fundamentally have an issue with Americans per se coming to vacation or to shop or to do business in Canada. What they're concerned about is that they are bringing a virus with which they could leave behind and would make sick Canadians. So you have to find a way to reassure people and to make credible the fact that the people you're letting in are not a threat to the public health of Canadians. And that's really the only way to do it. But politically, it means the government has to step up and say, here's how we're approaching this. Here's what our priorities are. Here's what happens if you do find someone who tests positive in the second test when they arrive in Canada. This is how they're quarantined. This is how they're returned to the U.S. or whatever it is. But you have to start having a discussion about differentiation between high risk and low risk. And indeed, as one who works on trade issues around the world, this is what customs services do everywhere on the good side, is they say, let's let the low risk stuff in so we can focus our energy on the high risk stuff. But you have to have a way to differentiate.
Eric, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on today. It's been a pleasure.
Eric Miller's the president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group. And while there has been business being done between the two countries, it's nowhere near where it was, nor helping business grow. Mary Scotty Greenwood is a former U.S. diplomat in Ottawa who leads the Canadian-American Business Council, and she joins us now. And Scotty, if the border remains closed until 2020, what impact will it have on both economies?
Well, we can't normalize border closure as between Canada and the United States. That is not a good thing for our way of life, our relationship, and certainly for our economy. It's understandable currently, given where the U.S. is and given where Canada is in terms of fighting back on the pandemic. But we've got to find ways to allow people who, for example, have property on a lot of the summer people, they call them in Vermont, have property on either side of the border to go in and check on their cottages. And then we've also got to figure out a way for in a safe, kind of risk-based approach, let people begin to resume travel. And there are all kinds of ideas out there about how you would do it. It includes, testing and certification pre-travel and once you arrive. But there's got to be a way to, in a smart, safe way, begin to reopen up this border.
How would you characterize the talks between Canada and the U.S. regarding a possible reopen of the border? They both sides say they're talking about it, but no, we don't really see anything about it.
I know that Canada's ambassador here in Washington, Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, has regular talks, weekly for sure, if not daily. She and her team are talking all the time to the White House and Homeland Security and other policymakers on Capitol Hill. And I think the talks are really, really good and productive. A bigger question is, I think in Ottawa and with the provinces, like how open to a reopening of the border are the leaders really, right? I mean, it's a tricky question, and it's something that I think my guess is there are plenty of Canadians that say, you know what, keep it closed, just keep it closed, period. we don't want Americans coming here or anybody coming here, not just Americans, that might make us sick. And that's like, that instinct is completely understandable. But from a policy point of view and from a business point of view, we've got to figure out a smart way to handle it. We can't just keep it closed forever.
You mentioned the leaders and what they want. Do you think part of the problem is, the border's a federal jurisdiction and issue, yet obviously it runs through most of the provinces, and those leaders don't really have the say?
Well, we've seen, and you would know this better than I, Ed, but you've seen provincial borders emerging in the Maritimes, in Quebec. Like, it's not just a Canada-U.S. thing. It's a how do you travel through Canada thing as well. So, the silver lining, if there is one, I think, to this whole experience is that governments, regardless of their jurisdiction or their political party, have come together, particularly in Canada, to figure out how to work on this. So I think it's bigger than any one office holder can handle, and I think you're seeing a willingness to talk to each other that's really quite hopeful.
Scotty Greenwood is joining us in the Unpublished Cafe. She's a former U.S. diplomat here in Ottawa, and she's the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council, as we talk about when the Canada-U.S. border may or should reopen. And would you like to see it possibly open in phases? We slowly open, to a trickle and then see what happens. What would you like to see?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we definitely need to look at phases, and we also should not try to look at a one-size-fits-all policy. Like, just to keep it completely closed or completely open doesn't work. So we started with, let's have an essential commerce exception, right? So if you're deemed essential, you're allowed to go back and forth. The challenge with that is getting that designation there's not a lot of transparency about how the decision is made, and there's not a lot of predictability. So I think if we could have a phased reopening where, for example, if people could show they've had a negative test within 48 hours of heading to the border, and then as soon as they cross, they have to have another test, to verify that people are healthy. And then they also have to adhere to whatever the guidelines are. So you've got to wear a mask, all of those sorts of things. I think that's the answer. And that's the way to start these phases. And once people have confidence that those measures work, then you can see it kind of broadening. But it's really important for the livelihoods of both Canadians and Americans that we figure out how to get back to living and working together, because that's, our whole economy kind of depends on that.
Have we seen other borders around the world that have opened safely?
Well, there are all sorts of different examples, and I'm not an expert on all of them, but I do think that the first step is to assure yourself that you've got the COVID-19 under control, and then once the public begins to think that that's under control, you are seeing opening up, but it's not all at once, and it's different, in every place. Australia and New Zealand open to each other, but not to the world, or things like that. So it's really dependent on where we're talking about.
How do you balance public health against economic hardship?
Well, public health is obviously the most important, or the more important of those two issues, right? People have to be healthy. They have to protect their families. This is a very serious challenge. So public health is number one, for sure. Economic well-being comes next, and it's also important. And I think the key is you can have both, right? Like the work on the vaccine is promising, but it's not ready yet. Testing is getting better and better, all the time. And then people taking the measures seriously, to social distance, to wear masks, to wash their hands and sanitize and clean surfaces, and all of those things. Those are things that allow business to resume, but also protect people's health. But which is more important? Of course, it's health.
Now, maybe when we look at that, the leadership down there doesn't exactly embrace public health against economic hardship. You think that's part of the reason Canadians are a little concerned?
Sure. I mean, you look at what's happening in the U.S. and you have to say, and I'm here in the U.S. and you have to say, this could have been handled differently from a leadership point of view. I don't want to make a partisan statement here, but it's hard to agree that the U.S. approach to this pandemic has been anything other than problematic, right?
Yeah.
I understand the whole world looking at the United States and on this and several things and scratching their head and saying, "Goodness gracious, does it have to be this hard?"
Scotty, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to talk to you, Ed.
Mary Scott Greenwood is a former U.S. diplomat and the CEO of the Canadian American Business Council. The Ambassador Bridge between Canada and the U.S. is the busiest crossing on the continent. More than 1/4 of all trade between Canada and the U.S. happens between Detroit and Windsor. Brian Massey is the MP for Windsor West, and he joins us now. And Brian, you can see firsthand the impact of the bridge being closed as well as the border. What's it look like in Windsor?
Yeah, it's really different. I've been on this file for a long time. In fact, my first public meeting was in 1997 to try to get a new border crossing, which we're building is the Gordie Howe. So it's that long and that important for our community. It's just different right now. The trucks are going for just-in-time delivery and for other types of goods and services that are authorized, but there isn't the human passenger cars and the back and forth amongst families right now. So it's a little bit of an odd experience because our settlement here goes back historically over 300 years, and it's always been based upon crossing back and forth between the United States and Canada. Is
there a lot of local pressure to reopen the border?
No, there isn't. There still is a general, a kind of a good sense that the United States is having a difficult response to say it the polite term in terms of dealing with COVID. And there's a recognition, though, that it is impacting us, that there needs to be some special exemptions in the process to be put in place for families to be able to reunite and also to deal with tragedies and other, significant issues related to health. So there is still a well appreciation of the border staying closed. as an overall kind of position. But at the same time, we're seeing some, unusual cases that are really affecting people's mental health. And we just dealt with one, for example, real quick, of parents wanting to come and visit their daughter who's dying in a hospice, and they were denied to be able to come over to Canada, even though they wouldn't even necessarily have to go anywhere other than just from their car to the isolation room where their daughter is at. And the government said no to that, and won't change their policy. And meanwhile, you can drive to Alaska through British Columbia or Saskatchewan, stopping several times. So there's an inconsistency with regards to how it affects people. Inconsistency.
What about transparency?
Well, there's that too, and I actually asked that to Chrystia Freeland in the House of Commons at the beginning of COVID, and what was on the table to talk with the United States, and she responded saying that we don't give away our trade position, and it's not a trade position. This is about what's being discussed amongst the two countries, and people just need to know what's on the table. And I think it's fair, because it's not a position of winning something and losing another. It's about whether or not are we going to talk about family reunification? Can we talk about ways that we can have isolation and testing beforehand for special cases, and then for example, tracking individuals coming in for those special occasions and measuring and making sure they're accountable so they can do that for cases like I just mentioned. And they won't even come up with that to us, and that's very condescending in my opinion, because there's nothing at risk there in terms of being open to the public.
Brian Massey is joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. He's the MP for Windsor West as we talk about the Canada-U.S. border and when it may or should reopen. And from your perspective, has the federal government been prudent in its handling of the border closure?
Yeah, well, I give them a B. I mean, as a New Democrat, we've really been pushing the issue to be more open and transparent to people and dealing with special occasions. I mean, and also we have to deal with our transportation routes. But where I'm very critical of them right now, though, is they don't want to do the hard work necessary to deal with some of the humanitarian cases that are taking place. And we've proposed 3 different types of options for the government to deal with these types of humanitarian situations, and they just refuse to act on them. And it's just not fair, and it's very stressful for families, because they go from week to week, and then eventually a decision is made, and they still don't know when they're going to actually see different people. And again, I mentioned about driving to Alaska. You can basically do that through British Columbia, Saskatchewan, get there, and drive back again. But meanwhile, over here, we have these cases where people can't be reunited, and they're willing to do all the things accountable to make sure that they don't spread COVID, because they don't want to make their own family members sick. But at the same time, they're not even allowed to actually apply for a fair process. There is an exemption process in place right now, but it's one that's not very thorough, and it's also not very accommodating, and we just haven't had anybody actually pass through it yet.
You mentioned 3 options offered. What were the 3 options?
Well, essentially, we proposed that, and they built around a process to make application to the minister and his office in a special application process that would be vetted, similar to immigration. And then we offered to follow all the health and safety lines. People have offered, say, for example, to even sign affidavits. People have offered to do extra testing beforehand. All those things that would add an extra layer of accountability, increasing the fines and penalties of people who did not actually follow through with what's been expected on them. All those types of things based upon a triage process that the minister would have some capability of to process those claims and look at those exceptions. Again, the one case I mentioned is the person that's dying in hospice, not being able to see her grandparents, and essentially they could come over to Canada after being tested and not have to go anywhere else other from their car to the person's room, and then from the room back to the United States. We can put that even on a transponder. We could even put it through a tracking that they do. And then on top of that, you can do follow through to make sure that they do those things. And if they ever did something that they weren't supposed to, then they'll never be allowed back in again during the pandemic. And a fine and penalty. So we're proposing things to raise the expectation level on the families that will be able to actually have some reuniting together.
Is it time both countries started working on a phased-in approach to reopening?
Well, I think there definitely is that work that needs to be done. That doesn't mean that we do it, but it's a planned way of actually changing the operations, and I think that's very successful. When this took place, we proposed to the government to have services available for healthcare workers, because in Windsor we have about 2,000 people that cross over into the United States that do healthcare. And we proposed to them, and some of it did come into play later on, but it took a little while, but to be prepared for those people coming back. So they had supplies, they had PPE, they had all those different things when they crossed. They could go home without having to make stops for somewhere. There was food available. All to do is to limit the opportunity for exposure and for potential problems. And so I would argue that that needs to be done as well right now too. Let's not fall into a decision. So let's start looking at those opening potentials. And again, that goes with being open to the government, saying, these are the things we're going to talk to the U.S. about, and these are the ways that we would, think about, changing or opening up a little bit more. But they're planned, and they also include healthcare people. They include the CBSA, and also the Department of Homeland Security. So all the logistics are worked out as well as the practical things. Because if we do have a second wave come forward, then we also know how to turn things back the other way. It's better to be able to do that in a measured way as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction.
When will you feel comfortable reopening the border?
I don't really have an answer for that. That's a great question, a fair question. Right now, I would say that we need to be similar to what we're doing now, but we do need to have an exception process for families to be able to be vetted, to be able to reunite and to have some of those experiences that are sad sometimes, but are necessary for families to experience, whether it be the funerals or we have, special moments that are more positive, and also, of course, the moments that I've mentioned before. But I think that in a general spec right now, we're opening up our schools in Ontario. Michigan still has some significant problems, so we need to stay strong with regards to how we're doing this. But again, I think the more we're open in the public about how we're considering, opening things up or closing them down, so people understand that, gives people confidence and also gives them as much, mental wellness as you can give them, is because they have expectations that, things may not change for a month or two, but here's what we're going to be talking about, and if we do change them, this is how it'll look. And so that may not help a lot of people, but at least they'd understand what's taking place.
Brian, I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and you have a wonderful day.
Brian Massey is the MP for Windsor West. And that leads to our unpublished .vote question. When will you feel comfortable reopening the Canada-U.S. border to non-essential travel? 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or longer than 12 months? You can log on and vote at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. I want to thank Eric Miller, president of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, Mary Scott Greenwood, CEO of the Canadian American Business Council, and Brian Massey, MP for Windsor West. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.